Hi students, welcome back to Geology. We are going to wrap up our conversations about crustal deformation with earthquakes, shaken not stirred geologically. So we are going to take a look at some notable earthquakes and what ground shaking looks like and all of that good stuff. As you go through this, I want you to think, I want you to ponder, why do you think the same earthquake might cause a lot of damage in one place but very little in another? So think about that distance from the earthquake that we talked about in the last lecture and what that might look like for ground shaking. All right, what controls the level of ground shaking? So we've got three things that are major contributors. The magnitude, which we've already talked about. So the more energy released, the greater the magnitude will be and the greater the ground shaking is. The distance, so the farther you are from the epicenter, the less likely you're going to experience intense shaking. So the energy starts to dissipate, and that means that the further you are from the epicenter, the less ground shaking there will be. If you're really close to the epicenter, though, the ground shaking is going to be pretty intense. And then the geology. What does it look like below our feet? Do we have loose soils that amplify the ground shaking, or are we on hard bedrock that will help waves move through quickly without intense ground shaking? So let's take a look at each of these individually, starting with subsurface geology. So shaking is going to depend on what the substrate looks like. Are we looking at bedrock, well-consolidated sediments? Maybe they're poor sediments, or maybe we're looking at something like a bay mud, like in the Bay Area. So as seismic waves move through material, you can think of this as like jello versus concrete. The jello will amplify when you shake it, right? Whereas when you shake concrete, it's not necessarily going to move a lot. It might break if you move it enough, but it won't sit and wiggle like the jello will. So as seismic waves move through these different materials, they amplify more where there's more void spaces. So when things aren't well compacted together or crystallized together, you're going to get a lot more movement or amplification of these waves. The higher the amplification of the waves, the more ground shaking there is. So you can see in the bedrock, the amplification of the waves is not very big. But once you get into the Bay Area mud, it goes up a lot higher. And so there's going to be more ground shaking where there's less consolidation of materials. So if we look at the two seismograms on the right-hand side here, the top one is A and the bottom one is B. Which one do you think would be bedrock? That would be B, right? So B would be how that seismic wave is moving through, or seismic waves is moving through bedrock, whereas A would represent something more like mud, where there's a higher amplification. All right, some secondary hazards from earthquakes. Land elevation changes. So when a fault ruptures, we've talked about dip slip faults. When normal and reverse faults occur, there's some sort of elevation change. And because there's an elevation change, we can measure that distance. We can also measure distance on a strike slip fault, but that's more of a horizontal distance instead of a vertical distance. So we can see some of those things. That's the upper right-hand photo there for you. Liquefaction also occurs. So this happens when soils lose their strength and stiffness during an earthquake from all the shaking, and there's rapid movement. And what happens is groundwater comes up and starts to fill in all that space where stuff is being moved around, and void spaces are there. And then material will sink into, it's basically like quicksand. And then after the earthquake is done and things are settled down a little bit more, the water goes back down and the material regains its strength and stiffness, and then things get stuck. So it's literally like making quicksand during an earthquake. That's the bottom right-hand photo there, where there's some cars stuck in some mud. Tsunamis also occur. These are probably one of the most common things that people are familiar with as a secondary hazard to earthquakes. Anytime there's an earthquake along the coast of California or somewhere in Japan across the Pacific Ocean, they send out tsunami warnings for Hawaii and California, the coast of the United States, the west coast of the United States, just in case there's a tsunami that comes through. I think there was one this last summer in 2025, and it hit Hawaii at like an inch or something from an earthquake in Russia. But that's not always the case. If you're in Japan and there's an earthquake, those tsunamis can get huge. And I'll show you some images of some from 2011. And then landslides can also occur. This is just slope failure, and slope fails for a number of reasons, one of them being earthquakes. So if there's ground shaking, material that was barely hanging on might fall or fail, leading to landslides. And that's the upper left-hand photo there. All right, so some destruction factors. So what dictates what material is going to do? So this is a little bit of engineering for you. So depending on the building materials, whether they are flexible or they are not flexible, you are going to see a different resistance to the damage. So in reality, we want something that's going to perform elastically so that it can kind of bend and accommodate that stress and then go back to the way that it was. So one of the interesting things about like skyscrapers, a lot of them are built to sway. They are designed to sway with the earthquake, because if they're too rigid, then they are going to likely be destroyed, like this highway overpass here. So things like unreinforced masonry is the most devastated by ground shaking. Wood framing fastened with nails are most likely to survive. Steel has the ability to form elastically, so it can sway. So a lot of those buildings are made from steel, not necessarily masonry, which is what includes concrete. Intensity and duration. So if the shaking is for a very long time and there's a lot of it, it's going to increase our destruction. And then resonance. This occurs when the seismic wave frequency matches the building's natural shaking frequency. That's that swaying that I was talking about. So if we can get our really tall buildings in resonance, so they're going at the same frequency as the seismic waves are coming through, then our building is more likely to stay intact and not completely get destroyed. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the seismic network and how it informed where our plate boundaries are. This is just bringing you back to that so that we can talk about the different plate boundaries and what the earthquakes will look like in those locations. So this has all of the plates on Earth here, and then it shows you on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, it shows you the seismic network, and you can see that where the red dots are where the plates are meeting. So with our divergent plate boundaries, those are going to be really small earthquakes because plates are just moving apart. So there's not a ton of friction going on. Things aren't running into each other. So it's just whatever motion the plates are doing, small earthquakes. With our transform plate boundaries, so something like California, where things slide past each other, we have larger magnitude earthquakes like 7. Continental collision, where two continental plates are colliding, we have very large earthquakes, magnitude 7 to 8. And then at our subduction zone, where we have oceanic plates subducting beneath continental plates at a convergent plate boundary, those are our largest earthquakes. We call them colossal size. They're larger than 9 magnitude. So in the United States, this is a look at what our seismicity looks like. Most of it is centered around the plate boundaries. There's a few exceptions here and there where there's some really old faulting that still occurs every once in a while from the origin of like the Andes and things, the Appalachians. And we can also see some swarm of earthquakes where we have volcanism like Yellowstone, the Cascades, Hawaii, of course, in the bottom right-hand corner there. And then we have like the tail of Alaska. That's where the Pacific plate is subducting beneath the North American plate there. So you can kind of see what the seismicity looks like. And then we can also look at the seismic hazard. So again, where we have mountain ranges, there's still some leftover tension there where we get earthquakes, but the majority of the hazard lies where we have plate boundaries or there is constant volcanism like Hawaii. In California, our biggest hazard is, of course, where the San Andreas Fault lies, and then where we have some other major faults like the Garlock that runs through Tehachapi Pass in Southern California. It's that transect that goes east-west. And then in Eastern California, we have another fault system over here called the Sierra Nevada Frontal Fault System, where the Sierra Nevada is uplifting on the west-hand side of that fault. Earthquake frequency depends on size. So depending on how often the energy is released, you're going to see larger or smaller earthquakes. So if the rocks can release the energy little by little, then there's not going to be a lot of built up tension. There's not going to be a lot of built up compression or shear stress in the rocks. And so they're releasing it in little earthquakes. If that tension or compression or shear stress gets built up for a long time in the rocks and it isn't released in an earthquake, you're going to get much larger earthquakes. So frequent earthquakes are usually small. Infrequent earthquakes are your larger ones. In California, there's some notable earthquakes since 1970. Some of these might be familiar to you, some of them maybe not. Ridgecrest was a big one in 2019 that happened around the 4th of July. And we felt ground shaking here in Fresno, which was cool in my opinion. But there's some others like Northridge in 1994, excuse me. Northridge was a problem. I think I talked about that in one of the previous videos, where we didn't know there was a blind thrust fault there. It occurred. It caused a 6.7 magnitude earthquake, and the area was devastated. We'll go through a couple of them that are notable here. The San Andreas Fault, San Francisco, 1906 earthquake. Everybody knows about this earthquake. So this one happened prior to knowing the damage the San Andreas Fault can have on an area. This was a magnitude 8.5, one of the largest recorded in Earth's history. Caused $400 million in damage, 700 to 800 deaths. One of the things that's really interesting about this earthquake is that they framed it as a fire so that people weren't afraid to reoccupy the area once they got all the damage cleaned up. So a lot of the newspaper articles really emphasize fire to try to dissuade people from being afraid of the area. Now, we know it today to have these really tall skyscrapers. It's really built up, but they have much better infrastructure than we did in 1906. So hopefully if we experience another 8.5 along this portion of the fault, it wouldn't be as bad as it was in 1906. There's also the San Andreas Loma Prieta, which occurred in 1989. This was a magnitude 7.1. It had 63 deaths, which is a little bit better than the previous earthquake along the San Andreas. 3,700 people injured, though, and $5.9 billion in damage. If you can imagine what those numbers would look like in monetary value today, that would be pretty significant. San Andreas Northridge, I've mentioned this one already. The Northridge Fault is like a sister fault to the San Andreas. It's not along the actual San Andreas Fault, but it's related to it. This was a magnitude 6.7, like I said. We have a lot of damage to freeways, which you can see in these photos. 57 deaths, 11,000 people injured, so that was not great, and $40 million in damage. The Ridgecrest 2019 earthquake I mentioned once already. This was 2 sets of earthquakes on the 4th and the 6th of July in Searles Valley in Southern California. So this earthquake occurred on a fault that we didn't necessarily know existed, that had the capacity of almost 6.4 and a 7.1 magnitude. Luckily, it's in an area that doesn't have tall skyscrapers. The construction was fairly decent, and much of the damage was to roads and to the rocks, of course. You can see the elevation change there in the right-hand photo. Japan also gets earthquakes. Those were all California. Now we're going to move to some other areas on the Earth. Japan has a very unique situation in which they have 4 different tectonic plates interacting. This is not ideal. And there are at least 2, if not more, convergent boundaries here. So they get really large earthquakes, and they're a small island, relatively small island, that has built up these huge skyscrapers. In 1995, they experienced the Kobe earthquake, which was a 7.2 magnitude, and it had $200 billion in damage in 1995. 5,500 deaths and 26,000 people injured. So they are a high-density area experiencing really large earthquakes. Not a great situation, but they make the most of it by having really great engineers that do their best to try to to try to construct everything in resonance, especially the really tall skyscrapers. Another devastating one in Japan was in 2011. That was one of the largest recorded in this area. It was a 9.0, $309 billion in damage, 15,703 deaths, 4,600 people missing, and 130,000 people displaced. The majority of this damage was from the tsunami, which is there's a picture of on the left-hand side there. And so this was devastating to Japan, and it's taken them 15 years to try to recover a lot of this damage. Haiti. So we're going to talk about a couple of areas now that are not so equipped engineering-wise. The structures in Haiti are not really to what we would consider code here in California. And in 2010, they experienced a magnitude 7.0, and it caused billions of dollars in damage, 170,000 deaths, and about 1.2 million people homeless because their buildings, as you can tell, completely collapsed. Their infrastructure is poor, and they don't have geologists and engineers that are constructing their buildings to withstand a 7.0 magnitude earthquake. So this was a devastating earthquake for them in 2010. More recently, we saw in 2023 a magnitude 7.8 in the Turkey-Syria area. This is along the North Anatolian Fault, which I think I showed you in one of the last videos. And this caused somewhere between 10 and 100 US billion dollars in damage. In Turkey, there was about 50,000, almost 51,000 confirmed deaths, almost 300 people missing, and over 100,000 people injured. And then in Syria, there was about 8,500 confirmed deaths and 14,500 people injured. So this was a huge, huge devastation to Turkey and Syria. And it's only been a couple of years. They are still working on trying to recover from that. So some final thoughts, just to remind you, plates cause faults, faults cause earthquakes. Earthquakes are a release of energy from the fault, the motion along the fault. And the largest earthquakes on Earth are near subduction zones. Ground shaking is determined by energy release, subsurface geology, and how close you are to the epicenter. Earthquakes do not kill people, though. I know I just went through a bunch of slides that were a little bit sad, and it showed a lot of death. But earthquakes are not what's killing people. It's infrastructure. So you can blame engineers. Just kidding. If you are standing in the middle of a field and a 9.0 earthquake happens, the worst that's going to happen is you're going to fall down. If there's no trees, there's no buildings, there's no freeways, there's nothing around you, the worst thing that happens is you fall over. So I want you to remember that earthquakes don't kill people. Falling objects do. Okay. So I'll leave you with this. What factor do you think is most important in determining earthquake damage and why? And I will see you guys in the next videos. Bye.